All right. Well, good morning, everyone. And knowing how Zoom works, we probably will have a couple late joiners. So, wanted to welcome everybody. Thank you for your time this morning, joining us on our first virtual convening. Just wanted to give everybody an opportunity to kind of level set on some basics around adult learners and the importance of it. Very happy to have the ESG team on who's going to do the bulk of the presentation today. And this is really just kind of the first of a series of convenings that we'll be doing to share some information and insights. Our next one will be in January, and we'll go over that at the end, but that'll be an in-person convening. And today's main topic is, really just going to be going through kind of understanding and supporting the adult learners, just that kind of basic level setting of some of the things that we hope to explore as we go through this design lab process with each of your institutions. So that's kind of the background. I want to welcome everybody. And again, remind folks that if you have an opportunity, please update your Zoom screen name with your institution. And with that, Christine, if you want to move on to the next slide. So diving into the agenda, first off, welcome and updates. So we'll get into some updates here shortly. Then the ESG team will be going through kind of that understanding and supporting adult learners, providing some additional background, emphasizing the importance of this segment of the population, one, to the state prosperity, of course, but also to the institution's prosperity and, some of the unique challenges and promising strategies on helping serve these adult learners. Then we'll have some time towards the end, depending on the size of the group we end up with. We may end up doing some breakout rooms. We may just have a kind of shared learning discussion with everybody on Zoom. And then we'll close up the meeting with some next steps and opportunity for any questions. So that's the agenda for today. If anybody has a question on that, go ahead and feel free to, either raise a hand or toss it in chat. If not, we will move on and I will hand the reins over to Christine.
Well, thank you, Jeremy. I do want to remind folks also, those who are just joining, to rename your PIN with your organization so that we can shout out our various organizations as we're going along. So good morning. We oftentimes start with a quote. So today's quote is "Action expresses priorities," and Mahatma Gandhi is the person who shared this particular quote. And one of the reasons why it's important for what we're talking about is if you set something as a priority, it's a lot easier to take action on it. So one of the things we'll talk about today is what are some really strong priorities for better serving adult learners at our institutions. One of the things you'll hear me do is a lot of times say "our" and "we," because I come from a teaching and college background. So I feel like we are a collective community when it comes to education. So we have a couple key partners. Some of you were on the call when we did our kickoff call, but just wanted to remind folks of who the partners are that are a part of this work. Obviously, you've met Jeremy with the Michigan Center for Adult College Success. Myself and my colleague Disraeli, and I think my colleague Eric may be joining, are part of Education Strategy Group. We have Sova on the call as well. They're our design process lead. And so you'll meet a number of those team members if you haven't already, as well as College App, who will help us with some of the data mining and modeling. And then, of course, rounding out the team is Talent First, who's working with the ESG team on some labor market analysis that will help to inform what are some of the really great fields that we should be prioritizing in our respective regions. Our goal today is to prepare you all to strategically utilize state grants and other potential funding opportunities. That's just the overall goal of Michigan Ray's work. We also wanted to take a moment to remind you all who all the institutions are on this call. You'll see a couple of institutions with asterisks beside them, and that's because they have chosen to partner together in this work. So we have one partnership between Glen Oaks and University of Olivet, and then we have another partnership in the Kalamazoo area. So really excited to dive in and see what happens both individually and collectively among these institutions. Also wanted to take a couple minutes to share some important dates. We shared these at the kickoff meeting. We've got a little bit more refinement now on those dates, and we will send calendar invites for each of these. But do want to give you the early heads up so that you can mark your calendars. So in early January, you'll have your design sprint kickoff with the SOVA team. And that's each college meeting with the SOVA team, as opposed to a collective meeting where it's all the colleges together. Then toward the end of January, we'll have our in-person convening. Grand Valley State's going to be hosting us. So we're going to be excited to join the Grand Valley State team in person. And we'll generally try to do this 10 a.m. to 3:30 for those who do want to make the drive in on the same day. But we do recognize some folks may need to spend the night, and we'll talk a little bit more about some logistics of that later today and in the coming weeks. Then in February, we'll do another virtual convening. And what you'll see is we're alternating virtual and in-person convenings. We'll have our next in-person convening in March, and then follow that up with another virtual convening in April. And you'll see some of the high-level topics that we'll talk about. More information will be added about each of these as we get there. You also see overlaid on this important dates, the list of when the RFP gets announced and when they expect the proposals to be submitted. And these dates will be refined in terms of giving you specific day of the month as we get closer to those. And yes, those should be 2024 dates. Thank you. I don't know how I missed that. My head is still going to be in 2023 for at least a good 2 months into 2024. And I appreciate that. Thank you. All right. So let's take a couple minutes and dive into a better understanding of adult learners and how best to support them at our institutions. So we want to talk a little bit about some of the objectives for understanding adult learners. So let's start by making the case for why adult learners are key for building a more prosperous and equitable Michigan. We'll also add in some priorities. We're going to lift up some priorities to equitably serving adults, including some strategies and actions that you might find useful. And then the third thing that we're going to look to accomplish today is to create a space for everyone to learn from one another on how they serve adult learners currently and ways they might want to improve moving forward. Daniel, yes, calendar invites will be sent for all of those dates a little later this week. Some of them we're finalizing the location, like, for example, that March convening. The next thing we wanted to do is to take a little bit of time to just define what we mean by adult learners. And what's interesting about this definition of adult learners is that depending on who you ask, you might get a very different definition. The term adult learner is a bit funny because government recognizes an adult as anyone who's over 18. But that's the overwhelming majority of our college students. So that would mean all of our college students are adult learners. But a lot of times in the field, we have a tendency to change that language to focus on folks that are beginning or restarting their post-secondary journey after the age of 25. These are individuals that are sometimes referred to as non-traditional learners because they have one or more characteristics that are considered non-traditional in higher education. And that could be things like filing independent, they could be parents, veterans, they could be working full or part-time. They may even be only attending college part-time. So sometimes these two terms, non-traditional and adult learners, are synonymous. What we want to do at ESG, a lot of times we try to lift up less deficit-based language and focus on the positive. So we usually use the term post-traditional learner. We find that a little bit more humanizing, and it acknowledges that students with quote-unquote non-traditional characteristics are now actually more like the norm in post-secondary education, at least increasingly so. Fortunately or unfortunately, post-traditional learners is a mouthful. So for ease of communication, a lot of times we'll just use the terms adult learner. recognizing that this is something like 60 to 70% of college students that we actually have. So for purposes of serving adult learners right now, we want to encourage you to use the broad definition of adult learners. And that broad definition includes anyone who has a high school diploma or an equivalency and is 1 year or more removed from high school. And that's very similar to the definition that's used for Michigan Reconnect. So when it comes to serving adult learners, we want to encourage you to use that broader definition. Sometimes when we have to report on how many adult learners we're serving, we're probably using the 25 and older moniker in that particular case. So let's take a look at what do we mean by that. So I gave you a couple of examples of adult learners, and in Michigan, we're talking about something like 2.5 million adult learners that lack post-secondary credentials. That's about half of the adults in Michigan, which is some very large numbers. And these learners are skill seekers, they're GED holders. Sometimes they already have a degree or a certificate, especially if they're transitioning from another country and they just need to get some credentials in order to get a job. We have a whole large population of students that are some college, no degree. And you'll see that these adult learners are not monoliths. So they may be both skill seeking and parents, or they may be immigrants and degree holders. They may be justice impacted learners. There's some really great programming in Michigan associated with justice impacted learners. But all of these learners have one thing in common, and that's that they want to strive for better for themselves and for their families. And it's our job to support them in that goal. So one of the things you'll see here is that one of the reasons why we prioritize adult learners is that there are some very major demographic trend shifts that are happening that make them even more critical to our workforce. Nationally, you'll see that the numbers of students who are under 25 are dwindling pretty significantly. So that's what we oftentimes refer to as that enrollment cliff. And I know many of you are familiar with that enrollment cliff. If you take a look at where Michigan is, you'll see most of Michigan is red, as many areas of the country are. And those are places where the numbers are projected to be between 6 and 60% lower in terms of the numbers of 25 and younger students. Nationally, enrollments among adults over age 30 are actually increasing at many of our institutions, and that's a good thing. But one of the things we have to be mindful of as these enrollments are increasing is where are these learners entering our institutions. In most cases, what they're specifically interested in is short-term training. Sometimes that's skills training, sometimes that's non-degree credentials. And that's their entree into many of our institutions. So it's important for us to recognize that this is where they're starting, but we want to be able to build paths to longer term training because that leads to more reliable and stable employment and better wage outcomes. So you'll see some of those employment rates. If someone has just a short-term credential, which is absolutely a good thing, their employment rates are about 77%. As they get an associate degree, that number increases to 84%. And once they've got a bachelor's degree, those employment rates nationally are even higher. So those are the reasons why we want to build pathways to those increasing credentials. So let's take a look at what this means for Michigan. So why adult learners matter in Michigan in particular. We talked a little bit about education equaling economic opportunity, but these are the numbers. When you look at the numbers of the poverty rates for working age Michiganders, 25 to 64, if they have less than a high school degree, that poverty rate is 26%. By the time they get to a bachelor's degree, that number is 4.1%. So you can see why building pathways into associate degrees and even into bachelor's degrees becomes really important in Michigan. We also want to take the time to focus on decreasing or closing those demographic gaps. So you'll see disparities in post-secondary attainment in Michigan. For white students, the numbers of students who have some sort of post-secondary credential, about 42%. When you look at Hispanic populations, that's 29%, and Black populations are only about 27% have some sort of a post-secondary credential. So the more we focus on doing more for adult learners, the more we're going to be able to impact these demographic gaps. And we're not really just talking about the demographic gaps and what programming can look like. We're actually talking about numbers. We're talking about economic mobility and the vitality of our communities in the state. So you'll see some pretty stark numbers that can be achieved here. Some pretty overwhelmingly positive numbers that can be achieved when we focus on adult learners and making sure that they have post-secondary credentials. So what I want us to do for a moment, and I'm going to preview this by saying we're going to talk a little bit about some strategies and some actions to be ready for these adult learners. Let's say we're able to recruit large numbers of adult learners into our institutions. We kind of need to be ready for them at our respective institutions. And so we'll talk about some priorities for being adult ready, some transformational priorities. So you'll see 5 of them listed here. As we're going through this, would love for us to do some interactive conversation on the side. So I want you to put your multitasking hat on for a minute, not for email, but for engaging in a document that we're going to drop in the chat, a link we're going to drop in the chat. So as we're going through these 5 different priorities, would love for you to take a moment and think about where you are. Are there places where you are doing these things now? Are there places where you'd like to do things differently? Are there places where you may be encountering obstacles and would like to really dig in and address these? So what I'd invite you to do when you open this document, and as we share some of these things, make a note in that particular box of something that you know that you're doing well, or that you'd like to do better or different, or some barriers maybe even that you'd like to eliminate in particular. Feel free to drop your institution initials or name in there and what that practice is. And part of the purpose behind doing this is, again, to encourage us to share what we see. Toward the end of this workshop portion of the our time together, what we're going to do is we're actually going to pull up that document and do a little discussion around what this looks like more broadly across, so that this is an opportunity for us to learn who's doing what and where other folks may have similar focus areas as we're going through this. So let's dig in on what these priorities are and how we kind of identified what these priorities are. So these 5 priorities were identified as a result of a combination of qualitative interviews and summaries of some existing work and reports over the course of the last 5 years of work. So we interviewed dozens of organizations, and they were combinations of institutions, state leaders, and even some policy and advocacy organizations on how best to serve adult learners, both at an institutional level and even at a state level. So today we're going to share some of the high-level strategies that align with these priorities and some promising actions that were identified in the Michigan report that we shared before, and we'll share it again. The links are a part of this presentation as well. So you'll have an opportunity to take a look at both the Adult Ready Playbook and the Michigan report on adult learners. So you see here listed the 5 priorities that we're going to talk about. So accessibility being the first one. And accessibility has a number of different definitions. What we're focusing on here are post-traditional learners being able to effectively access and move through our post-secondary systems. A big piece of this is around finances, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get to that point. Second one that you see there is around program change, making sure our post-traditional learners can thrive and feel engaged within our post-secondary classrooms. This becomes really important. If the majority of the students are what we consider quote unquote traditional students, sometimes adult learners don't feel as comfortable. And we've heard this from focus groups with these adult learners. They're not sure that they belong when they're in settings that don't feel like they are welcome. Third thing you see there is operational change. Post-traditional learners easily able to navigate post-secondary advising and administrative systems. So this is a priority for making sure that our institutions are set up to serve these adult learners, not just our classrooms. Fourth thing you see there is data. We will talk a little bit about the need for data and making sure that we are authentically measuring and using this data for ongoing improvement, making sure that if we identify that there are some disparities, that we have an opportunity to address those disparities. And then the last one you'll see there is around partnerships, making sure that we've created some partnerships that will allow these post-traditional learners to seamlessly interface between higher education systems and trusted community and industry partners. And there are a whole host of them. So we're not just talking about employer partners, but community-based organizations that can help with things like basic needs, et cetera. So let's dive in on some of these strategies. So what you'll see as we go through these strategies is we will share the 3 strategies that we identified as part of our report. We are not going to dive into each of the actions for every single one of these. This would be a much longer presentation, but do encourage you to read this. We will highlight a few of these, particularly as they overlap with the same priorities and actions that were identified in the Michigan report. So let's start with accessibility. And I mentioned post-traditional learners being able to access and move through. I also mentioned that a big part of this is about making sure that that state aid and institutional aid works for these adult learners. The second thing being making sure to use these financial levers to increase engagement and progression for these learners. And then the third thing there being about conducting comprehensive outreach to all post-traditional learners. And this is where we're going to spend just a couple minutes in terms of a strategy. So one of the things we wanted to elevate is conducting broad and targeted outreach to make clear the value of post-secondary education and the range of programs and financial opportunities that are available. Some of the barriers that students see when they're considering whether or not to engage or re-engage with post-secondary systems is, I don't think I can afford it. Or I'm not sure that I'm going to get a good return on investment as part of this, as part of participation in this. So that's why we recommend conducting this broad-based targeted outreach. And our colleagues at College App are going to help us with better understanding how to do that when we meet in January. So really excited to dig in with that team there. So the second strategy that we talked about was program change. And this is making sure that the programs that we offer provide an opportunity for our learners to feel welcome and engage actively in this. So 3 strategies that are associated here: delivering program content in adult-friendly ways, designing programs for flexibility and convenience, and we'll share an example here. And then for strategy 3, developing pathways that leverage and support all skill and preparation levels. And we'll actually provide a couple of different options for strategy 3. But first, let's start with strategy 2. So thinking about implementing flexible scheduling, including synchronous and asynchronous options. Curious to know how many folks currently offer things like 8-week courses. We have some colleges that we work with that actually offer courses for the 3rd shift. So some overnight courses. So folks who work and don't get off until 11, they can still go straight into a classroom setting after work and then spend their days resting before they go back into the work. So lots of flexible scheduling options. That's not necessarily right for every institution or population, but just knowing that that's an option, and asking the students, the pool of potential learners, where they may need coursework is helpful. Let's talk about a couple of strategies associated with developing pathways that leverage and support all of our skill preparation levels. So we see a couple of them identified here. So widening the availability and variety of support services, including advising and early warning systems, to really capture where some of the challenges are that the adult learners are having. Sometimes that also includes identifying and connecting the learners with basic needs supports, co-requisite supports, and providing help with students who need to earn credits instead of just spinning their wheels in remediation. More and more institutions across the country are eliminating or reducing the amount of remediation that students need in order to be able to engage in post-secondary education. That's where you see the preponderance of things like co-requisite models really increasing in utilization across colleges. A second potential activity that you could do here is increasing the use of accelerated programs to support faster career advancement and earning potentials. And a key to that also is recognizing prior learning. We're talking about adult learners, many of whom come with some sort of experience outside of the classroom. That means they may have been in a job and they're just looking to upskill. Being able to give them credit for what they already know so that we can accelerate their pathway can certainly make a big difference here. So the next one we want to talk just briefly around is operational change, and that's making sure that it's pretty easy for our learners to navigate. One of the really great best practices is to create a one-stop student experience. So every student, when they come into the institution, engages with one central office, whether that's a welcome desk, some sort of one central phone number that where they can engage and get most of their questions answered, either directly or at least be connected with someone who can do that. And the second strategy you see there is developing efficient systems for tailored student advising. And that's the one we're going to spend just a moment with an additional activity on. So thinking about how we identify and eliminate barriers to transfer, some of that can be through reverse transfer. Would love to know, as you all are identifying these strategies in that separate document, how many of you all are doing reverse transfer at scale, which means any institution, any student who transfers to a four-year institution, they are encouraged and given the information to share the credits they're earning at the four-year institution, so that then they can use those and apply them toward the associate degree. This also requires some pretty strong inter-institutional partnerships and some program alignment. We mentioned that these students are engaging at starting in non-credit programs or skills training programs. But if you create very intentional alignment between those programs and associate degree programs, then students are much more likely to be able to utilize those. And those need to be communicated very clearly to the students before they finish that non-degree credential program. So let's talk about data for a moment. In order for us to really identify how best to serve these learners, kind of got to know who's in the programs that we have, who's making it through the programs, who's missing from both the enrollments, the persistence, and the completion. And even as we look to emphasize transitions between non-credit and credit, being able to capture and identify who's in those respective populations. So strong data systems are going to be important there. So we want to look to see how we can leverage high quality data systems to monitor program success and to be able to adjust our services to meet the needs of these learners. But in order to be able to do that, got to develop those strong data systems. And when you have a relatively small IR shop, maybe looking for some efficiencies of scale. So maybe some opportunities for collaboration between institutions and within institutions. And then the last thing we talk about is around partnerships. These are strong employer engagement partnerships that promote the program relevance. So we want to make sure that the programs that we are offering are aligned to labor market demand in our respective regions. That's one of the reasons why Eric and Matt are working on some labor market analysis for each of the institutions. That's why we asked you all for your service areas, recognizing that some of your service areas are very broad, especially for our four-year institutions. But really wanted to take a look at what's available in terms of jobs, what are being prioritized, what are some contextual factors for the regions within which you all operate. And so that's why the strong partnerships with employer partners becomes really important. And then the second thing that you see listed there is all about those wraparound supports. We talked about basic needs, transportation demands, and a whole host of other things, especially for parenting students, that become part of those wraparound supports. And those don't have to be things that your institution has to offer. If you don't have the capacity, you can partner with community-based organizations to offer that, or even just connecting students to some of the social services that are in their respective communities. But best to do that in partnership so that you can do a nice warm handoff to those supports. So really great best practice here is partnering with employers to create guided career-aligned pathways. Very interested to know also, as you all are engaging with the document, how many of you are doing guided pathways, capital G, capital P guided pathways, where you are literally aligning pretty much everything, but not just within your institution, but for those of you at community colleges, aligning it to the four-year institution programs. And making sure that those programs are, as I mentioned before, aligned to labor market demand. So would love to hear more about how folks are doing that. So making sure that the degrees and credentials meet those education and career goals of the adult learners, which means in many cases asking what are the learners' education and career goals. So would love to know how many folks are doing that as well. So what I'd like to do now, and that was like the really fast version of this, and I mentioned before that each of these strategies has a whole host of different activities and some case studies that you can learn from as part of this document. And we're happy to dive in on some of these with respective institutions as you identify priorities. One of the reasons why we go through this and ask you all to do the self-reflection, the self-assessment survey that we sent out earlier is so that you can start identifying where are there things that you are doing well and or may want to prioritize increasing. And so some of you all have already started having your self-reflection meetings. Others are still working on getting those scheduled or have them scheduled over the course of the next week or so. But that's what these strategies are in many cases are tied to. So you can begin to identify, no, we're not maybe doing this, but this is a great opportunity for us to dig in and do a little bit more. So let's learn from one another. Looks like we have right on the edge of the number of folks for doing breakouts. So why don't we stay in the same room? Disraeli, did you already create breakout rooms?
I have them if we need to use them, but we can all stay in the same room if you like.
So let's, since we do have right on the edge, if you've already created breakout rooms, let's just go ahead and do the breakouts then.
It's up to you. Like, so, I don't have to hit create.
Yeah, let's go ahead and do it, just so that we can do some more thoughtful engagement. So what we're going to do in these breakout rooms before Disraeli opens them up is what we are going to do is we are going to take that document that we have been that we shared earlier on and start to identify where are the places and that institutions are doing these things or would like to do things more. So we'll just talk a little bit in our smaller groups, come together again and share just some key takeaways from those breakouts. We're going to be in those breakouts for about 20 minutes, give or take. And given that we will probably have something on the order of about 30 people in each of those breakouts, rooms. Want to encourage folks to actively participate in the conversation. If you haven't had a chance yet to drop something in the document, it's okay. There's no time like the present to do something like that. So I'm going to stop share so that we can head to breakout rooms. So Disraeli's going to cover one of them. I'll cover the other one. And then we'll just have a chat for about 20 minutes, give or take, on some best practices and things that we're interested in doing more of. All right. Let's go with the create.
And I just need to assign us separately, Christine.
No problem.
I just got to make sure everyone.
Looks like everyone's making their way to the rooms.
Okay, good.
If you haven't seen it yet, there should be a button at the bottom that says breakout rooms.
It's got Zena, Jason, Paul. Okay, so I'm going to put you in room 1.
Okay. Can you just assign Paul, Jason, and
it's random.
It's random. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. No worries.
So they're already assigned to a room.
They just
Paul
need to
is
click on
in
it at the bottom.
room 2. Yeah, let me move him.
Okay. How do I go to room 2?
So you should see an option at the bottom that says breakout rooms, and it should tell you which one to join.
Got it. Thank you.
Oh, Christine.
Sounds good.
All right, now I got to figure out how do you know how to get in there?
Yeah, we should just be able to join.
Oh, okay. Hold on. Sorry, it's been a minute.
Okay. So thank you all so much for actively engaging in that conversation. Very much appreciate it. We had a phenomenal conversation in our breakout room around a number of things that folks are both interested in and or doing well. Talked a little bit about rural colleges, a little bit about co-requisite employer partnerships. We also talked a little around what things we could make automatic. So things that might require some data sharing agreements. So one of the things I want to encourage, and Disraeli, I'd love to hear a little bit about some of the things you all talked about in your room as well. But as we're sharing these things, would love for folks to, if you put something in that document, please put your college name or at least your college initials, although for some of you like MCC, that might be a little challenging, but put your college name so that we can start creating some connections between institutions. This is super helpful for us. So Disraeli, what did you all hear in your room?
Sure. We primarily spent a lot of time kind of talking about accessibility, program changes, and so forth. And a couple of things that institutions are doing include things like 8-week courses, weekend courses, and trying to kind of play around with the scheduling thing. But one of the interesting comments that was kind of brought forth was that some of these work for some programs and not others. So there's a need to be very strategic about which programs you're using these additional formats for, considering the other implications for it, and then what courses really do work well and should remain kind of at the 16-week level for the students. In addition to that, when talking about accessibility, nowadays, there's lots of different modalities that students can take their classes with or through. And so sometimes there's some creativity there, or in terms of like one student may choose one class that's in person and then might choose another class that is going to be hybrid or so forth. And then what kind of spaces are we creating on campus for that student to be able to go into a room and take their course, because that's what they need in that particular point in time. So there's lots of kind of creative things that are going on, which do bring up other questions as we try to adapt to some students being in high flex classrooms versus being in person, having other responsibilities and so forth. Similarly, we talked about that in terms of orientation, enrollment, and just the variety of students that we have and what options are available there, whether it's a mandatory in-person enrollment or we're creating on-demand enrollment and orientation and those services. So lots of interesting kind of conversations surrounding that and how are we meeting the multiple needs of adult learners in today's day and age. And a lot of that COVID really kind of forced us to kind of rethink some of the services and how we're offering it. And so trying to kind of work through that. And then lastly, one of the common themes that I kind of picked up on is the communication to the adult learner, right? So we might have these services, we might have these variety of modalities to make it easier for them, but does the adult learner know? Does the adult learner know that there's credit for prior learning that can kind of help be a quick on-ramp into a particular program? Do they know about certain financial aid offerings that are available? Do they know about student support services that are available? And how do we send that communication to them so that they're informed and they can take advantage of what some of these services are offering? So that's my quick recap. I know I missed a few things, but anyone else from the room want to kind of elevate something that we talked about or that you shared? Right, that was group 2.
Excellent. Well, thank you all again for actively participating in this conversation and populating that document. Again, we'll share this document. You should have access to it, but we'll also just make sure to share it when we share the recording as well. So what we're going to do now, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again. And Jeremy, if you could start with our next steps, and then I will close us out with a couple of notes.
Yeah, be happy to do that. And I want to thank everybody for their participation again today. Some great conversations. I have read volumes of material, had lots of great conversations, and I still learned something today. So really appreciate my learning insight of the day was the challenge on students having the online and in-person schedule, and the students that were running at a 10 o'clock class in person and then having an 11 o'clock online class, trying to find a space to do that. And it's a heck of a challenge. And all of the volumes I've read, that's not something that's ever been raised. So it's great to hear, those on the ground experiences from each of the institutions and what you're seeing and experiencing, so we can help better work with you in addressing some of those challenges. So on the next steps, please complete your individual self-assessments if you haven't already, and make sure to schedule your self-assessment reflection session. We're trying to get those wrapped up here before the holidays. And make sure to come to your reflection session with an ability to schedule the design sprint kickoff meetings with our SOVA team, who will be running the design sprints. Please hold January 23rd from 10 to 3:30 for our in-person convening. Again, they'll be in Grand Rapids. Our friends at Grand Valley are going to be hosting us there. And as Christine noted earlier, we'll be working on getting calendar appointments out to folks. And Christine will be touching on travel. And Christine, I'm going to freelance just a little bit, so I apologize to the team in advance here. No. I'm also going to add one more little challenge to the next step. So as we're all heading out to the holiday season here shortly, we will see friends and family. And to just kind of further think about the challenges adult learners face when you're at those gatherings, find somebody and ask them, all right, if you had to go back to college now for a degree, what would be your challenges, barriers, questions that you had on how to even do that? It's a great opportunity to kind of get outside of our current bubbles. This is something I always used to do in my previous thing. I always made my family gatherings, probably got annoyed at it. I would always ask them some random question about a problem I'm trying to solve and get kind of that, mini focus group user experience, if you will, from somebody who's a potential candidate and get their 2 cents. So I'll throw that challenge on with folks just to kind of keep this top of mind as you're going into the holiday season and seeing, friends and family that aren't living and breathing this every day, to kind of get some perspective. With that, I'll kick it back over to Christine if you want to touch on kind of the travel expenses with the upcoming January meeting and any other questions.
Yeah, no, I love the crowdsourcing solutions and identifying barriers, just absolutely phenomenal. A couple last minute things. you all received an email, or at least many of you did, to update your service areas. I think we have most of the service areas updated. Do want to make sure that we have the full list of who's on your team as well. So definitely share the names, email addresses, preferably titles, as much as possible, because this helps us to get a good feel and plan for both in-person engagements as well as our virtual engagements. So certainly I encourage you all to do that. So Jeremy mentioned that we are going to be in Grand Valley in January. We have, with the generosity of the state of Michigan legislature, the part of MCACS's resources, as well as Kresge resources, will be able to pay for modest travel expenses. We are not going to be staying into the Ritz-Carlton or anything like that, but some modest travel expenses. Those that are comfortable with doing a day trip, certainly encourage you to do that. We'll pay for mileage. We will certainly feed you well while you're with us, and the like. And for those of you who may need to come in the night before, certainly we can cover the hotel room for that. So we'll share an email that's going to have some information that we'll want you all to pull together. It may not go out until early part of next week, just because a big piece of our team is currently traveling right now. So it might not go out until Monday, but do be on the lookout for that email. And in the meantime, I guess I will kick it right back to you, Jeremy, to just send some final thank yous.
All right. Well, again, I want to thank everybody for participating. Thank you to the ESG team for their work and presentation. I know thank you to the rest of the design team that are working on this, college app folks, Andy and crew that are on, Allison and the rest of the SOVA team, Bruce and Jennifer. Appreciate your participation today, because this is all going to help us inform our work. With that, if there's any questions, feel free to raise a hand or put something in chat. We'll happily answer them. As per usual, if you think of something after we hang up from the call that you go, gosh, I would have asked, as always, and I'll remind everybody of this, let's not suffer in silence. If you've got a question or a concern at any point in time in the process, please go ahead and email us at thecenter@talentfirst.net. We will make sure it gets in the hands of the best expert on our team to answer and get you an answer promptly. And I think with that, that kind of covers the docket. So any last minute which email to send updated team members to? You can send it to thecenter@talentfirst.net. And we will get that. And that was a good reminder, again, to make sure to send us updated team rosters. So anytime you have a change in your team roster, because we know they're going to be fluid throughout this process, go ahead and you can email us at that center@talentfirst.net list.
I'll also add, if you aren't receiving emails or calendar invites, we may have an error in your email address, but we did encounter a few of those as we were going through this. So thank you all.
Thank you all. Have a great week.
Hey, Jeremy, I have a question for you. Once it